able to do collectively. What I always like to say before our presentation is that there are so many of us working around the state doing similar things, and it's because we have a lot of heart in the work. And for anybody who does call in, we know that it's a really difficult thing to do, to talk to a stranger on the phone. So as you are listening to this presentation, even though, as I was talking about with some colleagues before, we do this every single day, we're very used to talking about sexual violence all day, every day, it doesn't mean that everybody else is. So for anybody who's listening out there, please remember to practice your own self-care. Please take care of yourselves, if that is in the form of just taking a break, turning your camera off, walking away, going to the bathroom, getting a drink, reaching out for support. Our hotlines are always on and available for you, but we also have several advocates here in the chat too. So if you ever need anything, we are always available. But take care of yourself first and foremost. All right, so down to business. So some of the things that we want to talk about today, given the time that we have, are more broadly, again, just about the history of Asian Americans in the US and how have we come to be here and what has that journey looked like. Understanding the intersections between SV, sexual violence, and DV, domestic violence, within these communities, because we talk about Asian communities very broadly and very generally, but what we want to highlight is that there are many different ethnicities that make up the AAPI community, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We specifically want to talk about especially the barriers to services for these communities. Although we exist around the state, why is it that maybe within our actual service numbers do we not see representation from these groups that we are serving? We want to discover recommendations for overcoming barriers. So not only identifying what they are, but how do we address those? How do we integrate those kinds of services into our organization so that we may be more helpful, more accessible? And then identify resources for these communities themselves. All right, so let's just jump in.
Just before we go into this, I'm really excited about this historical timeline portion. But as Asia said earlier, we usually are talking about Asian Americans as one large group, and we are going to highlight some of the different ethnic histories that are at play here. Want to also name that there's no way that we can include all the different histories that are happening because there just are so many. But this is an attempt to give us all some understanding of Asian American history because it informs the ways that violence plays out today. And as we move through the timeline, I encourage y'all to think about the ways that these events inform both racialized and sexualized violence against Asian American people.
Right. And something I didn't mention before, but if you all do have any questions, please also feel free to write them in the chat. We did designate some time at the very end of our presentation to answer any questions that you may have. So as they pop up, maybe I might not be able to get to it right now, but I would like to go through it and make sure that I answer afterwards. All right, so starting now, I'd like to say that in the past decade, we've definitely seen a drastic increase in the number of visibly recognized Asians, right? Both on screen, behind the screen, we see them in tech and social media, and even in our own public policy, not only nationally, but locally, right? And I think this is a really amazing thing. This is really great in terms of how we identify and how important it is to be able to see people in public that look like ourselves. And while this may be true now, certainly this has not always been the case. As I said, just probably in the past decade, we've seen this spark in visibility. So why I say that is because I want to make sure that even though we are here in 2021, it is important for us to all understand the historical context as to what brings us all here. And that's kind of what I would like us to start with and go through. So the first emigration of Chinese into the US started in about 1850, and this was the promise for a new life. Many individuals from China were coming to this country during the gold rush to seek work, to seek wealth, to seek a new start. But as with many histories of many other immigrant communities, the start into the US was not always a very glamorous one, and in any case, not very glamorous at all. And even though there was a promise of new wealth and new life, these maybe stereotypes or myths about what life would be like coming into the US were not exactly what people thought. So especially when Chinese were first coming into this country in about 1850 to about 1865 seeking work, what they confronted were a large number of stereotypes and assumptions about why these individuals were coming from China. And what had grown into was this concept and idea called literally the yellow peril or the yellow danger, specifically referring to the color of folks' skin, yellow. And so what people in the US were saying about Chinese that were coming into the United States were that they were bringing in drugs, they were bringing in disease, literally viruses. They were the cause of a lot of trouble. They were more likely to rob, and they were also really dangerous. And these assumptions came out of what typically happens when anything new is introduced to a space, right? And so what you see here are several images, propaganda, but also comics about what US citizens thought about Chinese immigrants coming into the US. And as you can see, especially in the picture on the right, there was this fear that they were violent and would rape their children and kidnap their women and rape their women. And of course, none of this were true, but it came out of certainly fear of the unknown, but also fear of taking work. And again, not something unique to this community. So not too far after, between about approximately 1882 and 1924, what we see is a specific act called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that literally banned folks from China coming into the US, but also banned them from ever gaining citizenship. And so they put into practice and they put into policy their fear against specifically Chinese people. This Exclusion Act also included the ban of any women or children coming into the United States. And what you see on the bottom left-hand corner is a picture of, and it's a little bit hard to see or read, but it says the Chinese wall around the United States of America, literally trying to play on words, make fun at this idea that China has a great wall around it. And what the United States wanted to do was create a wall around itself. Not a new concept. We've all heard of it before. But create a wall around itself to protect itself from Chinese immigrants also coming into the US. And there was a book that was written by Julia Flynn Seiler, called The White Devil's Daughters. And in reference to the ban of any women or children coming into the US during this time, she wrote this compilation of stories about women who had and were able to come into the United States, but were forced to seek refuge within these safe houses because likely if women and children were brought into the United States at this time, it was because they were being trafficked. It was because they were being trafficked for labor or for sex. In order to protect these women, these missionaries had come together to create these safe houses. And this one was specifically located in San Francisco's Chinatown, but certainly they're not the only ones.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. So I want to name that immigration law and movement throughout American history is really colored by two things: racism and labor, specifically the need for cheap manual labor. And as Asia just said, when Chinese people were coming into the United States, a lot of the pull factor there was that there was the gold rush and the railroads that needed to be built and worked on, and Chinese people were brought in to do that hard manual labor. But when the Chinese Exclusion Act happened, that didn't mean that that need for labor disappeared. And then so other people were found to be brought in to do that labor. And that's what created some of the early waves of South Asian people immigrating into the United States. And typically this was Punjabi Sikh people. So this is people from northern parts of India. And they typically worked on agricultural industries in California. And just like how the Chinese people in the United States experienced the yellow peril, South Asian people in the United States started to experience the dusky peril. And it's the exact same racisms. The same fears of people taking jobs, of being sources of violence and crime and threat. I am specifically looking at this image over here, our first invasion of by Hindus and Mohammedans. And that is the word that was used to describe Muslim people. I want to name that also Punjabi Sikh people are Sikh. They're not Hindus or Muslims. And yet they were, I mean, racism is fueled by ignorance, right? It's not like people are really caring about what religion someone is. It's the fear of the other. So the Dusky Peril happened, and they also experienced very similar types of racism. And eventually, the Immigration Act of 1917 created the Asiatic Zone of Barred Citizenship, which disallowed people from basically all of South Asia and Southeast Asia from entering the United States. 100 years later, in 2017, the Muslim ban was put in effect. And did a very, very similar thing where it barred people from entering the United States under similar kind of like mappings. So we're saying again that the immigration movements in this time period, but also like past this time period, are really influenced by both labor, the need for cheap manual labor, and the need, or not the need, but racism itself.
So as we move a little bit more forward in time into approximately 1932 to 1945, what we also see is in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor during World War II, Japanese internment in America. And so as a form of retaliation, and as we've been talking about, xenophobia and racism are all fueled by fear. What had happened was the US decided that out of their own fear, what they would do was put anybody who had any Japanese ancestry or into these camps, afraid that they would be agents that would retaliate against the US government. They were secret spies, that there was any inkling that they would retaliate against the US government. And so during this time, not only were Japanese put into camps, but anybody who vaguely resembled somebody who was Asian was put into camps, because as we've been talking, Asian communities are often generalized. And so the difference between and among is not always made clear. And what that resulted was the internment of many Asian individuals. And while we are talking about, treatment of Asian communities within the United States, what I also want to recognize was that during this time, during World War II, not only were the US retaliating and committing violence of crimes of war against Asian communities, this was also happening within Asia itself. And so I want to kind of shift us over into mainland China, but talk about the enslavement of Korean women by the Japanese in China during that time. And so during World War II, the Japanese had enslaved these Korean women and called them comfort women. and use them as their own sex slaves to, quote unquote, increase the morale of the soldiers that were there, right? And so this theme of war and violence is oftentimes intersects with sexual violence. And that's why we wanted to put this in here, because not only is this something that has happened here in the US, we see it all over the world and with and between all kinds of people and all different kinds of communities. And sexual violence has always been integrated into these other forms of violence, especially war violence. And it's not something, of course, that we talk about very often, right? So in relation to World War II, we're also talking about the Vietnam War, and specifically between these two time periods, 1955 and 1975. It's very interesting to note, especially now, as a person, again, who first generation American, family had come here from Vietnam and Laos. I would not exist as a person if the events in the Vietnam War did not happen, right? My family came here as refugees because of war. And so to understand that is one thing, but also to recognize it as an experience across an entire country, multiple countries, is something that I want us to pay attention to. So Memorial Day in particular and Veterans Day celebrations are always strange, especially for me. And because it's often talked about in terms of heroism, right? And great feats. But also on the other side, there's a lot of war trauma in history for many people, and a lot of that included sexual violence. And so this book in particular, Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, talks a lot about war violence, but also sexual violence. And a section of that book talks with this woman in an interview that you see here crying at the bottom, saying that at the age of 24, she was raped by soldiers who had come into her hometown, and she had lost everything that she had. And she talks about losing her freedom and losing a lot of what she had grown up with and herself. And there's a lot of war trauma that is not talked about, especially from this lens. But I want to make sure that when we are talking about trauma, war trauma, while we often talked about it in terms of different sides, everybody has their own story. And so to be able to bring light to those stories is important to understand not only the history, but just the impacts of intergenerational trauma and how trauma from previous generations of war impact even current day individuals.
I highly recommend this book by Ocean Vuong, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. It's Ocean Vuong is a Vietnamese American poet, writer, novelist. And the specific book is, and he's also from Connecticut, so shout out. And the specific book is written as a letter from the main character to his mother, who cannot read or write in English. And it talks about the main character's kind of experience growing up in Connecticut, and being raised by his mother and grandmother, who are both refugees of the Vietnam War. And it does a really good job of like talking about the like surviving through like the multiplicity of trauma, and the ways that they just like were still able to like connect with each other through all of that. I'm sure that many of you are quite familiar with The Body Keeps a Score. It is kind of the book when it comes to talking about trauma and PTSD. The doctor the doctor who wrote the book is the person who came up with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the book is really important because it talks about the ways that trauma lives in the body and in the mind, and these things are all connected. And it is a really, really important book. And I started reading it a couple of months ago, and then I stopped because I got really frustrated with it. And I'll read a passage from the book because for some context, a lot of the first couple chapters of the book, the doctor's talking about his experience of working with veterans and the ways that he realized trauma was impacting their health. and the ways that they connected with other people. So we'll read this passage together. Feel free to like type in anything that you notice or anything like that. So maybe even worse for Tom, and Tom is one of the US veterans that the doctor worked with. Maybe even worse for Tom than the recurrent flashbacks of the ambush was the memory of what happened afterward. I could easily imagine how Tom's rage about his friend's death had led to the calamity that followed. It took him months of dealing with his paralyzing shame before he could tell me about it. Since time immemorial, veterans like Achilles in Homer's Iliad responded to the death of their comrades with unspeakable acts of revenge. The day after the ambush, Tom went into a frenzy to a neighboring village, killing children, shooting an innocent farmer, and raping a Vietnamese woman. After that, it became truly impossible for him to go home again in any meaningful way. How can you face your sweetheart and tell her that you brutally raped a woman just like her, or watch your son take his first step when you're reminded of the child you murdered? Trauma, whether it is the result of something done to you or something you yourself have done, almost always makes it difficult to engage in intimate relationships. After you have experienced something so unspeakable, how do you learn to trust yourself or anyone else again? Or conversely, how can you surrender to an intimate relationship after you've been brutally violated? For me, a lot of this, the first couple chapters of this book felt really problematic. And I just felt really uncomfortable because there was a lot of grace and patience and humanity given to people and patients like Tom, who the doctor is working with. And that entirely makes sense to me in some ways, because obviously the doctor has his patients that he has to take care of. And the work that comes out of the doctor's studies is obviously really, really important and crucial. But in this passage, I'm also seeing the dismissal and the dehumanizing of the trauma that happens to the Vietnamese people. I also want to name that what Tom does in his, as part of his unspeakable acts of revenge constitute as actual war crimes. And I am troubled by the ways that the doctor just kind of dismisses what happens to the Vietnamese woman and to the children over there, and the ways that that trauma is not recognized at all. And for me, I'm often thinking about the diagnosis of PTSD and how it comes from care and treatment of veterans, which is entirely important. I'm not going to like dismiss that, but it isn't talked about with complete recognition of like where else this trauma is coming from. And I wonder a lot about the ways that this diagnosis of PTSD isn't inclusive of the racialized and sexualized violence because of its origins.
And just to go off of that too, Nani, like I'm really glad that you talk about those things, because especially as service providers, and many of you are direct service providers, that's not something that we would necessarily know, right? Unless we had read this book or unless we had delved into like what the history is behind these different groups of people that we're talking about. So, you know, with complete respect and recognition of all the work that has been done in those fields, we just, again, want to make sure that it is with recognition of all the other places that this trauma exists. So, again, moving forward into 1966. So, after the internment of many Japanese, one single article basically is responsible for the birth of what many folks know as the model minority myth, right? And so this article was written by William Peterson, and it is called Success Story, the Japanese American Style. And so, in this newspaper article, essentially, what he talks about are the absolute resilience of the Japanese people in response to and in despite of having been put into camps within the United States. And what he mentioned was that even though this was a terrible and tragic thing that had happened to them, that they, as a individual group, as a culture, were able to come together and still thrive. And what he does is he talks about the financial success of the Japanese, despite all of their hardship, and especially after their internment. He talks about this group of individuals being smarter and being higher achieving in school. He talks about this group being more apolitical, so they didn't cause any trouble. So if there were any crimes that were happening in certain areas of the country, it was less likely that they were these individuals committing these crimes. And what sparked out of this article and conversation was, again, just a generalization of how Asian people and the Asian communities are. So not only were just the Japanese Americans viewed in this way, but also other groups of Asians. And while that may seem like a compliment at first glance and at face value, this does a slew of other things, right? It generalizes an entire group of people based on the experiences of likely very few, right? But also, it creates really unhealthy and unrealistic expectations of what an entire group of people can be. But what it also has done, especially throughout the years, is create this tense dynamic between communities. And what I'm talking about is different communities. And specifically, when they're talking about the model minority, they're only talking about Asian communities. And to be pit against other communities was the purpose of saying something like this. Why can't other communities, no, doesn't matter who they are, be as high achieving despite them being new to this country, despite them being put into camps, despite them having faced hardship? And as we all know, especially on this call here and on this training, which I'm all sure you're familiar with, like, just because some individuals have one experience, it doesn't mean that all individuals have the experience. And this internalized racism and external racism has played out in a whole bunch of different ways. So, if you want to go into that too.
Throughout this presentation, we'll go through a couple graphs that kind of break this like myth of the model minority. And one of the most common model minority stereotypes is that, oh, Asian people are so smart and they do so well in school and all of that. And this graph shows us that in 2017, 53% of Asian Americans achieved a bachelor's degree or higher compared to the 33.4% national average. And that sounds great. However, if you break down the ethnicities and nationalities, that's not true across the board at all. We're seeing that Taiwanese and Indian people they have the 75%, that they are actually like skewing the data over, versus we're seeing groups like Burmese, Cambodian, Laotian, and Bhutanese experiencing something completely different, even much lower than the national average. And part of this is because of immigration history, right? So I know that like with Indian immigration, really in the past couple of decades, Indian people were only allowed to come to the United States if they had some sort of professionalized background. If they already had a bachelor's degree, or if they were coming to the United States to attain some sort of professional degree, like becoming a doctor or getting their bachelor's or whatever it is. So then that makes sense why Indian people in the United States have a much higher rate of getting a bachelor's degree or higher, because they're set up, and those people are already selected to come here to do that exact same thing. Versus we're seeing that if you look at the lower attainment rates, Burmese, Cambodian, Laotian, and Bhutanese people all have strong refugee populations, and a lot of them are actually coming here because they're escaping violent situations. And a lot of those violent situations, as we've kind of talked about, are these like, they're like survivors of the Vietnam War, of World War II. Bhutanese people specifically, there was ethnic cleansing that happened in the late 90s. Many people in the United States, actually a lot of people in Connecticut, are refugees of that violence. So then there's no, for me, when I see these conversations around the model minority, I'm always thinking about like whose stories are being uplifted and whose stories are being invisibilized. And we're seeing a very similar trend here with wealth. In 2016, the interracial wealth divide among Asian American households in Los Angeles specifically. For Japanese households, we're seeing an incredible amount of money, $592,000, versus Koreans are making their household income is around $23,000. Those are entirely different realities, and that's living in the same city. And I'm wondering a lot about how that determines access to resources and opportunities and the ways that people have to navigate different realities.
And I appreciate your comments too, Kara, in the chat. As Nani was talking, I was reading it, and it's right. There's a lot of jokes that equally happen around the AAPI community that are supposed to be well-intentioned, but just because people say those things doesn't mean it feels any different than any other kind of joke or derogatory statement. And Amelia, I actually do have one recommendation for a book about the internment camps. It was one that I had read actually in college in my freshman year, and it was called When the Emperor Was Divine. And I can put it in the chat here because I actually don't include it in our resources list that we're going to be giving out to you at the very end of the training. So thank you for reminding me. And I can put a more formal resource list too for you afterwards, but that's for right now. But to play off of all of the things that we've been saying, right? All of this timeline has taken place in the past, starting in, I think we started in the 1800s, right? And so even though that all of that seems like so far away, and all of these war crimes and acts of violence and the internment of the Japanese and exclusion acts seem so far away, the racism and xenophobia that existed then and the attitudes that have existed then are not necessarily gone, and we're not necessarily rid of them, because they definitely do still exist now. And we see that and have seen that, especially within the course of this pandemic, right? 2020, when I had done this presentation the first time, that was around the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of these photos are still from then. And I wanted to include them because the attitudes that people have and the fear that people have against the AAPI communities, in particular the Chinese community in this case, are still very well and alive. And when the pandemic had started, many businesses were put out of business, and not just because of pandemic. I think many people experienced that regardless of who you were, but there were many different Asian businesses, not even just Chinese businesses, again, to just talk about the generalization, that were targeted and looted and destroyed because of the assumption that Chinese people in America were the ones bringing this virus over into the United States, and were to be feared. And something that I think that came out of this, all of this, was, I think, the visibility of many Asian communities in the United States in ways that people never really thought of before. Typically, as I had mentioned before, Asian communities were always seen as apolitical. They didn't really take a side. They didn't really have an opinion, right? And they were just there under the radar and not attracting any attention. But I think what would happen out of this were a whole bunch of communities within the Asian community that were actually advocating for themselves. And you could see them walking on the streets and in parades and coming together in public spaces to talk about the racism that they were experiencing. And we saw this in different universities, which was really wonderful to see young people engaging in these kinds of political spheres and advocating for their communities, but also just talking, as we have been here, about how much racism and xenophobia has been a part of Asians' communities coming into America, and how that is it just looks different as time goes on. And what are the ways that we can be united in order to fight against those kinds of ideas and myths and stereotypes, so that we recognize the uniqueness of all different kinds of ethnicities within Asia, but also recognize that as we'd all like to think that violence is not the answer to individuals' fear.
So I'm sure that many of you are already also familiar with this. In March, unfortunately, there was the Atlanta spa shootings, and it was when a 21-year-old white man walked into primarily owned and operated Asian massage parlors, and he committed mass shootings. And Asia and I have talked about this, and it's been troubling to say the least, and was really upsetting on multiple levels. I am really thankful for the many different types of organizations and Asian American advocacy groups that have come together to really support the survivors and victims and their families of this violence. And particularly Red Canary Song, a New York-based organization formed by Asian American sex workers, does a really, really amazing job of like naming what this violence was. This is part of their statement. They said whether or not they were sex workers, and the they here is the victims and survivors of the mass shooting, whether or not they were sex workers or self-identified under that label, we know that as massage workers, they were subjected to sexualized violence stemming from the hatred of sex workers, Asian women, working class people, and immigrants. Red Canary Song just does a really great job of like understanding that this violence isn't separate, isn't just isolated, it's not unique, that it's actually part of these larger violences that we're seeing throughout the timeline. It's part of xenophobia, it's part of sexual violence, it's part of the hatred of sex workers, of Asian women, of working class people, and that these things aren't happening in isolation. A lot of artists also came together to create work in solidarity with and support of the victims and survivors. And I just think that a lot of the work that came out of this was very eloquent. In this image, they painted or illustrated some of the victims and said, "Against empire, patriarchy, and capitalism," again, naming the ways that this violence is a product of war, of class differences, of patriarchal violence, and that we need to move forward with love and care for one another. So that was our very large timeline, and there's so many more things that could have been included in there. We could, but then that would be like a PhD, so we're not going to do that. And of course, this presentation is really about how do we support survivors who are part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. What we know is that survivors of these communities are far less likely to report incidents of sexual violence or domestic violence, and they're far less likely to reach out for mental health support, whether that's therapy, counseling, group, or whatever. And this disconnect happens on multiple levels. First, one issue is that oftentimes, as we said before, Asian people are seen as a monolith. A monolith is a large and impersonal political, corporate, or social structure regarded as intractably indivisible and uniform. All that means is a monolith is a group of people where everybody is the same. As we probably and hopefully know, Asia is not a monolith. Asia is made up of different regions. Northern Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Asia, Western Asia, which we now really refer to as the Middle East, Southern Asia, and Southeast Asia. I personally have been really annoyed when people tried to tell me that India is not part of Asia. Very common thing that I hear for some reason. It is part of Asia. And just by looking at the map, there's so many different countries happening there, and there's so many different cultures, so many different languages, caste, religion, economic, even like the land is different across. I mean, that's like half the world, right? So there's no way that we can say that someone in Central Asia is exactly the same and faces the exact same historical and present circumstances as someone in Southeast Asia. The other map I have here is of the Pacific Islander region, which is a group of islands from Hawaii to Guam, and so on and so forth. I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about Pacific Islander communities and the issues that they face. which goes to show, like, again, the Asian American Pacific Islander community is so broad. In some ways, like, it's a really unwieldy term. And I also know that from what I do know, in my own kind of understanding, is that Pacific Islanders are marginalized within the Asian American community. And oftentimes they are trying to like uplift their own issues as being separate from the Asian American communities, because it's not a term that always makes sense. If the continent of Asia is not a monolith, we also have to recognize that Asian Americans are also not a monolith. Um, Within the United States, there are 22 million Asian Americans. 5 million are Chinese, 4.4 are Asian Indian, 4 million are Filipino, 2 million are Vietnamese, 1.8 million is Korean, and 1.4 million is Japanese. And there are many more. Again, this is another one of those graphs that help break down the model minority myth and show the diversity of ethnicities and realities within the Asian American group. In 2018, the annual median income of Asian Americans reached $87,000, which is, again, this looks good, right? It's 38% higher than the national median income of $63,000. But again, if we look at the breakdown, we're seeing that it's Indian people and Filipino people and some ethnicities, they're really pushing that rate higher. And usually it's because their like immigration and their employment backgrounds are more professionalized, versus that we're seeing some communities like Burmese communities having their annual median just be $36,000, which is 43% lower than the national average. So when we think about providing services to these groups, we can't be thinking about the model minority myth and thinking about Indian people in the ways that like, oh, like they're wealthy, have like good backgrounds or whatever that means, right? And understanding that people have different access to resources and really being more aware of what those difficulties might be. Also, Asian American people are part of the growing population of multiracial and multi-ethnic children in the United States. We're seeing that 14% of multiracial and multi-ethnic children are white and Asian, 3% are Hispanic and Asian, and 1% is Black and Asian. And these are some of the more famous multiracial Asian Americans in the United States. Of course, we have Kamala Harris, who's Jamaican and Indian. We have Naomi Osaka, who is Black and Japanese. We have Jenna Aiko, who is Dominican, Japanese, and honestly, many ethnicities that I did look up and now I forget. And Mitski, who is a Japanese and white American singer. I also want to uplift the work of Jihaji Sisters, which is a New York-based anti-violence group. And they work to empower Indo-Caribbean women. So they specifically are thinking about the multiracial Asian American women in the United States. And they do a lot of great work of, again, naming immigration and violence as kind of complicating the kind of realities of Indo-Caribbean women. I also want to take a couple minutes to talk about our work in Connecticut right now. There are 158,000 Asian people in Connecticut, and this population rose 60% from 2010 through 2016, so definitely a speedily growing population, mostly based in Fairfield, New Haven, and West Hartford, or the Hartford area. And the populations are mostly coming from South Asia and China. In South Asia, a lot of the populations are of Indian, Nepali, and Pakistani descent. These hubs of different groups is strong for one reason, right? Like, or many reasons, that it might be really easy to get to certain people, to be able to access their community centers, to do outreach, and to provide services. But we also want to be, again, understanding that not everyone in these communities have the same access to resources and opportunities, and being aware that people who of Indian descent have a very different reality than people of Nepali descent, a different reality of Chinese descent. And of course, if you're not one of those majorities, you have a different reality again. Also, there are going to be Asian American people who don't live in these hubs, and they have even probably even like a harder time accessing some of these resources. So just bearing that in mind as we do the work that we do. Just so that you have an idea of the rest of our racial ethnic breakdown in Connecticut, 12% are African American, 16.5% are Latinx, 0.6% are American Native, American Indian, or Alaskan Native, and 80% is Caucasian. Asian is 4.9%, Pacific Islanders 0.1%. So statistics as it comes to our work specifically, right? Sexual violence and domestic violence. 28.5% of Asian women report knowing Asian women who experience some kind of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse by a family member or in-law. We know that less than 1/3 of survivors will seek professional help. The Connecticut Alliance the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence has served 58 clients who have identified as Asian American, and 6 people who have identified as Pacific Islander in the past year. And these statistics below, sorry, my little Zoom thing is covering a lot of those statistics. So the 11%, 22.3%, 0.2%, 39.4% is the racial ethnic breakdown of the survivors that we serve, and the statistics in the box are the statistics of Connecticut overall. So that gives you an understanding of who exactly we're serving.
So keeping all of these things in mind, we want to transition into why is all of this information important to you? How is it relevant to the work that you do and the folks that you serve? So if we shift over a little bit into what the literature states. One, I want to make note that of all the expansive literature on sexual violence work, domestic violence work, all of that literature is great and it informs a lot of the work that we do, and I think it's important. Though something I did recognize in my own research and process was that very, very little literature exists around this community in particular. But what I wanted to highlight was a specific study done by these folks, George and Rashidi, in 2010, that interviewed 11 organizations in South Asia who directly worked with survivors of domestic violence. And in those interviews with those organizations, what they came back with were suggestions and recommendations by these service providers about how to engage with individuals within these communities. And some of the things that they noted were providing pre-crisis services was something that was really important. So what we mean by pre-crisis services are those basic need services, right? How can we expect anybody to dive into this higher level mental health work or healing work if they have no home to live in, if they have no food to eat, if their basic needs are not taken care of? So what they found was if they were able to perform outreach or connect with other organizations that could do that work, provide that housing and shelter, or go to food pantries, then they were more likely to retain the services or sustain services rather with these individuals. And they'd be more willing to come back to then address the healing work that they were more specialized in. So going off of that, another thing that they had mentioned in this study was that working with the community and family members was something that was really important. I think in the United States in particular, we are very what we call an individualistic society. So we care very much, and I think it's important that we do, about the unique accomplishments and successes of individual people. Everybody can make it out for themselves, right? You do the work, you put the work in, and you're going to achieve your goals. That's the kind of American mentality, an individualistic one that you achieve for yourself. Well, I want to compare that to then what many Asian cultures and communities and what many Asian cultures and communities also take on, which is a more collectivist mentality and what we call a collectivist society, wherein while each individual does in actuality have their own accomplishments and successes, it is for the greater good of the community that they are a part of, the family that they are a part of and belong to. So when working with communities, specifically the Asian and Asian American Pacific Islander communities, they achieved more success when they were doing outreach within the communities that they already lived in. So something to know about AAPI communities, and not all, but many, are that especially coming into the United States and immigrating here, what would happen was because there were such large structural language, especially barriers, what happened would these communities would create microcosms for themselves. So they would have their own grocery stores, they would have their own doctors' offices, they would have their own schools, daycares, mechanics, and anything that they would need for themselves developed and worked by people within their own community. So a lot of the reason or incentive to go outside of their community was very little because they provided everything for themselves. So when these organizations actually went inside these Chinatowns, right, or these other communities, they achieved a lot more success because there was no way for them to know about the services that existed outside. And the same thing working with family members. I think a lot of the work that has traditionally been done within domestic violence and sexual violence focuses on the individual, the survivor, right? I think there's a lot of merit to that. And I think a lot of that focus is rightful. But I also think that when we are talking about different communities, we want to acknowledge and respect that individuals, especially within the AAPI communities, consider themselves a large part of their families. And so to be doing that kind of healing work within those families as a whole, even though that might not be traditional in our sense, is really important to consider. Because if we're talking about being inclusive and being aware, trauma informed, that includes being aware of the historical and cultural context that people live within. The third bullet talks about collaborating with religious leaders. This is kind of along the same lines, right? If we're making sure that we are aware of these cultural differences, we want to make sure that we are reaching people where they are most often. And that could include any religious spaces. And as Nani has, we both have been saying, Asia is made up of so many different religions and so many different ethnicities. So the likelihood that folks would be in any one of these spaces is much higher, and you would speak to the values of that community when you are reaching into these religious spaces. The structural barriers are a lot more vague, but they primarily talk about the language barriers that exist. So if we are able to, within our own staff, within our own work field, provide avenues for individuals to communicate in their own languages, then it's a much more obvious reason why they would be able to attract and sustain a lot more of the services that they would have. And then developing alternative forms of service delivery. This is, again, a little bit of what I have been talking about before, but traditionally, what we think of when we think about healing work within these fields is doing one-on-one services, right? Individual counseling, going in and sitting down inside of an office. Well, those methods to service delivery, even as we experience them in our own coalition, I think it's fair to say, aren't ones that we see people from this community engaging in. So a lot of these organizations in the study said that, again, going into the community, talking to people, whether that be within grocery stores, within these community centers, was their best bet and best way of being able to even introduce their services. And even though I'm talking about this again in terms of the AAPI community, I don't think that any one of these things are unique and exclusive to just the AAPI community, because I think a lot of these practices can be brought across other kinds of communities and would be equally as receptive. It's just a matter of organizations like us being willing enough to learn and being willing enough to go in and outside of our own comfort zone and explore all of the other different cultures and communities that exist within our state, even just our state.
Asia, do you want to take this question? I feel like you might be able to answer it, but Sabina asked, in your experience, have you seen survivors being ostracized by their community? In many incidents, I've seen that it may look like the person has a lot of support, financial, emotional, housing, but the individual is actually very isolated. What recommendations would you have in this situation?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So thank you for asking it. I'd say yes to all of it, despite whether or not a person is from this community or not, right? The fact that we have a hotline that exists 24/7 is a wonderful thing. I think it's certainly the way that most people even first come to know about our services by calling this hotline and first become engaged with our services. But imagine just doing that, right? The hotline is made up of individuals and advocates from all around the state, but they're all complete strangers to you. And so, for any and most of the individuals calling our hotline, what does that say? Well, one, it says a great thing about us that people are willing to call us and talk to complete strangers about some of the most vulnerable and scary and traumatic things that have happened to them in their lives. But what it might also say, and not necessarily, there are certainly many people who have wonderful and great support networks within their families and their friends, and they still call the hotline. However, there are also likely very many people out there who are calling a complete stranger because they have no one. And despite what it looks like, despite, as you're saying, they have a financial success, they have emotional support, and they have housing, the act of sexual violence is inherently and purposefully very isolating, right? And so anybody who has experienced this, and especially within cultures and communities that don't talk about this, that aren't allowed to talk about sex, that aren't allowed to talk about their own bodies, that aren't allowed to talk, never mind about sexual violence or domestic violence happening within their families, there are very few and fewer spaces that a person who has those kinds of things in their life can go. So most often survivors of sexual violence are going to be ostracized, but especially when you have such collectivist communities, the resources are even fewer and fewer. So I think it's a really great question, and I want to validate all of those experiences. So maybe with recommendation, I think a lot of these things that we're talking about here, especially on this slide, are things that individuals or organizations can do. I think there are things, especially organizations like us, like DV, can do. However, when it comes to learning about what we can do, I think on an individual level, that's even more powerful than what we as organizations can do. And I think I want to get into that a little bit more as we talk about the rest of our slides. So keep the question on the burner. So the literature that I was talking about was done in 2010 by George and Rashidi. And so in 2017, what I did as a part of just my university research was to take all of those best practices that were provided by those organizations and ask us here in Connecticut, are we putting those practices, what are we doing with those practices? Are we integrating those practices into our organizations? So what I did in my own research was talk to service providers within our state. And actually there's some of you advocates. At the time, I wasn't a part of the Alliance, so I didn't know you all yet, but it was just a precursor into all of the work that we're doing now. But in this study, what I did was do 13 in-person interviews with 5 different agencies around the state of Connecticut. These organizations were made up of direct service providers, there were clinicians, policymakers, attorneys, and different kinds of administrators. And so what my ask of them was to tell me what did they think were the barriers to services for the AAPI community, and what were the practices that they did in the organization to, one, address those barriers potentially, or did they even acknowledge those barriers, and what did they think were those barriers for both themselves reaching out, but also for survivors reaching into their organizations. So what this resulted was a thematic analysis about all of these conversations, and out came these different themes, and that I will talk about soon, about what local perspectives were. And so you can see a picture of me talking with some of the facilitators of these different meetings and local presentations and trainings. The Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling poster on the bottom left-hand corner was just an example of an event that I attended, actually coincidentally during the time of my research study, that talked about how what the unique experiences were for Asian Americans within the US to achieve success. It was a very interesting meeting as well, an interesting panel, because all of the individuals on that panel were already doctors, they were already attorneys, and they were already what we would consider conventionally successful. So as we have been talking about, there's a lot of disparity and there's a lot of differences between and among the AAPI community that sometimes the AAPI community doesn't recognize themselves or doesn't ironically see themselves doing just as much as everybody else does. So that I'll go into talking about like that internal prophecy and how a lot of the stereotypes that are projected onto the community are also embodied by the community. And as a result of this study as well, since it was local, it was a great opportunity to connect with other resources in our state. And an example of that was this Captivation app. This app was developed by, I think, college students, and they reached out because they just wanted to know what are some of the resources for survivors of sexual violence in the AAPI community. And I thought it was the coolest thing because here I am just doing what I think is just a small research project for me in my last year of college, and people are actually interested in it. People are actually interested in learning about what resources there are out there. I can't say that there are very many, but as we like to say for even anybody on the hotline, it just takes one person to be responsive and trauma-informed and respond in a supportive way to potentially change somebody's life and facilitate their healing. And that's why we're here, right? So going into the results of my particular study, what we've identified were 5 major themes that came out of all of the conversations that I had with those 13 service providers. And the things that came up were a lack of cultural representation. The reason why they thought many individuals from the community were not coming into their services was because their service providers did not reflect the people that were within their communities. And by no means do I think that a service provider who is Asian is automatically qualified and automatically all-knowing of all Asian backgrounds, right? But there is a familiarity that is powerful enough to sometimes just get people through the door. And especially when you're working with communities that are simply just used to seeing people that look like them, that come from the same background, that come from the same similar and close families, it can be hard to reach out to outside organizations, especially for something as personal and something as intimate as an experience of domestic and sexual violence. So another thing that they talked about was a lack of language capacity, right? And I think this is a lot more straightforward. If we are not able to communicate in the same languages that people are familiar with and might be the only one that they know, it limits our ability to really do anything, not only provide the services, but also just facilitate the kinds of healing that we're used to doing with other clients who are primarily English speaking. And something that we noticed in these studies were that there are some words in other Asian languages that literally do not exist when we talk about comparing them to the English language. So talk about not being able to talk about sexual violence or domestic violence. Some of those words literally don't exist in those languages, or they don't especially exist in the ways that we talk about them. And so one of the recommendations actually that I had been given by a specific organization dedicated to servicing Asian and Asian Americans was that they don't call it domestic violence because there's no literal translation for this family in the language that they were speaking in. But what they did call it was like family violence, coming back to this collectivist kind of mentality and ideologies. It's that when we change the way that we use language, sometimes we are better able to relay what we mean versus just using what we're familiar with: domestic violence, rape, sexual violence. And so when they started using the words family violence, people understood how much it impacted not only them, but how their trauma impacted the rest of their family. And they were able to have more conversation, and a more broad conversation with family, which is not something that we, again, typically do when we bring in individuals for counseling. It's individual counseling. It's not necessarily a group counseling or with the entire family. It's an approach that is unique to this group. Again, not only to this group, but could be something that we all explore for the reasons that it seems to have been helpful for other folks. So going on to the third bullet, geographic isolation, is something that I've been referring to this whole time, but it's just to preface, like, what these organizations understood was that these communities were fully functioning in and of themselves. And so the geographic isolation pretty much barred out any other outside organizations from coming in or just being aware of what existed around them. So if organizations were not going into the communities, there was no way for these folks to know that they even existed. Another barrier were all of the discussion that we have been having about systemic and intergenerational cycles of abuse. Even though we do help individuals, absolutely, who experience sexual violence now or very recently, we have to take into consideration what the impact is of intergenerational trauma, how war trauma and violence and how genocide has impacted entire generations of families, and what that trauma looks like. So, as we know, trauma can look like absolutely anything. There's a broad range of symptoms and behaviors that can come out of traumatic experiences, and some of them are domestic violence, some of them are substance use, some of them are gambling behaviors, some of them are emotional abuse and manipulation. Like, they all intersect. And as Nani was talking about before, sexual violence doesn't just exist on its own. It's a result of a continuation of an intersection of all other kinds of violence. So being able to understand, again, the historical context, but also how it impacts entire families and generations can help us understand how these things came to be. And they're a lot more complicated to unravel, for sure, but a certain starting point. So the internal and external prophecies that I talk about are in response to the model minority myth that we were talking about before. Not only is the model minority myth something that has been projected onto the AAPI community, but something that also the AAPI community has embodied for themselves. And so the unrealistic and very general stereotypes and myths that have been imposed have been also put as a pressure within the community itself. So not talking about feelings as well, and not being able to talk about trauma, or not wanting to talk about trauma because it was so hard, is something, as a type of pressure and a type of mentality that has been taken on by a lot of these communities that prevent them from reaching out to other organizations. If one is expected to be successful, and one is successful, whatever that means, right? And one is financially independent and has a doctorate degree, does it mean that they don't need any more help than anybody else does? No, right? So I think this is a phenomenon that probably many people experience. And just because you don't look like you need the help, or you're struggling, it doesn't mean that you're not in as much pain or struggling as anybody else is. And it's something that we won't recognize. So to just summarize up what all of the organizations we're talking about, I just wanted to mention that all 5 agencies demonstrated elements of those culturally responsive practices that I had mentioned in that literature, in the article before. But that only 2 out of 5 were specific to the Asian community. So it's great that a lot of these practices were being used, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is any more engaging of the community that we're talking about. All right. And then just these 3 words, trust, community, and family, were literally the most used words in all of these interviews, and are pretty straightforward in an explanation of what was important, what is important to these communities: trust, community, and family. How can we use that knowledge, knowing and how can we use that knowledge to engage the community better, is what I wanted to get out of this.
So what can we do, either as service providers, or as people who just want to better the world? As an individual, I recommend that folks like follow and learn from as many Asian American Pacific Islander leaders and organizations. We will be sending out a resource list, and you can find different anti-sexual violence, anti-domestic violence organizations on there that focus on Asian American communities and different leaders who do that work. You can also diversify your media. I personally follow a bunch of different social justice media accounts on Instagram. I follow a lot of the organizations, and they put out great information, great trainings. But this also means like diversifying, like your books, your art, your music, your podcasts, and making sure that you are listening to as many specific stories as you can, so that when we're breaking down this idea of like the monolith, right, that Asian is not just Asian, but it's filled with so many different and multiple stories and histories. I also want folks, and this is also like for myself, that we are constantly challenging like our community's reliance on the mono-minority and Asian monolith stereotypes, and thinking about when people are saying things like, oh, Asians just have it so good, or just forgetting that there are so many different people within the Asian diaspora, thinking about like who is benefiting from this kind of rhetoric, why are people using it, and then who is invisibilized, who's harmed from things like that.
And probably just to speak to the question again that was raised in the chat, those are things, of course, that individuals can do, and we as organizations can also do as individuals working within those organizations. And I don't want to be too repetitive, but everything that I have listed here is everything that we have mentioned in the study and even in my own research. So these will be all the recommendations that I have. And certainly they are practices that folks are doing, which is wonderful. They're practices I think that we should integrate more into our organizations for sure. And even if you come from an organization that isn't specifically sexual violence or domestic violence, these are practices that any organization can benefit from, because 1, you never know who has been impacted by sexual violence or domestic violence, but also domestic violence and sexual violence don't happen on their own, and they are linked to all other kinds of violence. So being able to be trauma informed in these ways in a historical context and all the ways that violence intersects is a way that we just support communities and people within our communities in all the ways that likely most people need. As I said before, representation isn't the end all be all, recognizing that even of the folks that are within our communities, they don't know everything. I don't know everything. And just being humble about what you know and what you don't know opens doors to being able to just learn more and more and more. There's no limit to our knowledge, and acknowledging that just enables us to grow. And I hope to also encourage other folks to learn, but also to then show folks that we are most wanting to reach out to, that we're taking the effort to understand. And that we might not ever actually understand the experience that they have gone through, but that we are here in the ways that we present ourselves to be. And if we are organizations that they want to reach out to, then we are. And at the end of the day, there are so many other nonprofits and so many other organizations that are doing work. And just to be able to link somebody to that is meaningful enough. So this is just a small resource list for you all to take with you, all of which are also on the list that will be given out to you at the end of the presentation. But one of the things that I wanted to also highlight at the bottom of this list are that a lot of this work, whether it be direct service, policy, more macro level work, can be done in all kinds of spaces. So as direct service providers, you can go into universities and colleges, even cultural clubs and societies, fraternities and sororities, because some are culturally or ethnically based and some are not. Some are just willing to do community service work anywhere, and that's fine too. But especially engaging young people in this kind of work is really important, because they relate to these experiences in also very different and unique ways. Like somebody like myself, who didn't graduate from college too long ago, might have a very different experience as a Chinese, Lao, Vietnamese, American woman than somebody who is also Chinese, Lao, Vietnamese, who has been here for many generations, or whose family has been here for many generations. So talking again to and sharing information like flyers or brochures, if that just may be it, within temples or other places of worship, community centers, hospitals, grocery stores. Everybody goes to grocery stores. Nani and I were talking yesterday
It's
about
so important. This is like such a key outreach location. I was also gonna like, if you hadn't mentioned it, I was gonna be like, grocery stores are so important. Hotel Brothers in Norwalk, like every South Asian person I know has gone to it. Even people from out of state go to there. So like it is just so important.
Right, exactly. And like for me, my family always traveled like they didn't care how far they traveled to go to an Asian supermarket. So the one that we always had gone to growing up was Adong on Shield Street in West Hartford. And it's like one of the biggest Vietnamese grocery stores out there. And I actually have seen flyers from one of the resources that we have here is Asian Family Services, part of the community renewal team, place their brochures and flyers inside just the front entrance where all the newspapers and all the other salon flyers are, or other apartment flyers are. And it's a great way just to have that visibility, but also just normalize these conversations, right? If we come in with the understanding that these topics are taboo, that they're not allowed to be talked about, placing them right aside all of the other things that are normal as part of our day-to-day life is just one way that we can introduce the conversation and let somebody know that there's something that exists out there, whether or not we know it right now. So that's a wrap, Paul. Thank you again for attending this this presentation. Thank you, Nani, too, for doing this with me. I think it's really important. So if there are any folks that have any questions, these are our emails. You can contact us at any time, but also if you want to, raise them in the chat and we'd be happy to talk and have more conversation.
I'm also going to drop our workshop evaluation form. Would love any feedback if you'd like to share. If I can figure out the thing. I'm also thinking about the question that Sabina had asked earlier. And actually, my mom and I were talking about this training earlier today. And she was saying how like if she had to call somebody, she would feel uncomfortable calling somebody who was super, super well known in the community because of the ways that like intra-community conflicts can happen and like gossip and just like not feeling safe there. And I am thinking about those words of like trust, family, and community, and the ways that we need to like build that. And I don't know what those specific recommendations can be, but thinking about what it might look like to talk to a survivor of sexual domestic violence from any of these communities and say like, okay, like what can we do to build trust, community, and family, and maybe building those like smaller, safer spaces within those communities that are also connected to the resources that any of the member centers can provide or whatever it is. And thank you for putting your camera on because I could have like a face-to-face conversation with you.
Yeah, I guess I posed that question because I've actually had two women that I've been working with lately who, when you get introduced to them, they're like, their families, they have huge family support, and their, brother owns a big house, and they've got, she's living there, and everybody's like, oh, she looks like she's doing well, but she's absolutely miserable. So anyways, we were able to connect her, and that's what I was sort of saying was, I was able to find pockets of people that were able to sort of assist, but we have a huge backlash from her extended family because they come and see me to see who is the person who is helping her. And it's very negative, like, oh, so you're the one who's doing all of this and, trying to collect money for. Anyways, bottom line ends up being is that, she's very, very ostracized. We're getting there, we're moving forward, but it just was such an incredible barrier that even the people that I actually thought that I could count on ended up sort of, because they didn't approve of what she was doing in whatever way it was, I got a lot of backlash. So I just wanting to see if what your experiences have been with that, how have you handled the situation, just kind of what anybody else thinks.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for also doing the work that you're doing because it is really, really difficult. And I've noticed with my conversations with advocates who are trying to do outreach with specific communities that it's never just like, oh, I want to work with the Indian community and like we're the same. It's like, it's not, because there's so many different layers to each issue and it becomes so structural. Like the family members coming in to ask like, and like, what does that say about the respectability of this woman? And like, is she causing trouble? And like all these like other issues that are coming up. And there's just like a lot to unlearn and build. And I think so much of the work we do in like general anti-violence work is about like unlearning violent things and being able to build safer communities in whatever way that might look like. And it's not easy at all. And I'm really thankful for the work that you do and all the work that all the advocates do here.
Agreed. And I think it's I can't even say that I have had personal experience being able to work with an extensive, if even one person from the AAPI community, right? And that speaks to our accessibility of our services for sure. But I also think with this conversation, it's an opportunity for us to reach out to the services that we have provided, though of those services that are basically exclusively serving women in the AAPI community to see even what their ideas and what their experiences have been. because there's a lot of merit to those who have been able to, and I definitely think there's a lot to learn.
I also saw that Priscilla mentioned this is interesting, so much like what Black people and Black women go through in life and sexual abuse and domestic violence. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of like ways that like women who are racialized and experiencing racial and gender violence um, like experience many of the same things. So thank you for naming that.
Just one other comment. I know at the Women's Center in Danbury, we're actually Karen's on there. I see a couple of my friends are on there, and we're actually looking at pulling together a support group that is faith-based. We're kind of like working on it. We're in the process. We're getting there. So that's really another big thing that comes in, because I think the Asian community does have faith as part of their big, as a big resource, as a big part of who they are. So I don't know if you guys have had any, experience or any input into being able to like, because we're trying to sort of navigate that. Like, how do you bring faith into it and use it as a strength rather than as a as a pressure, or as almost a another barrier. And I don't know if you guys in your work have had any experience or any suggestions in how we can sort of navigate that field.
I think anecdotally, I think that's a great question, and I think it's really amazing that you're bringing that up and using it as a resource to provide support to individuals. I think it's very common, probably, for a lot of folks, especially working within organizations like ours, to avoid religion, right? To avoid talking about religion in fear of, the potentially even triggering some folks, because some of their trauma comes from religious spaces, right? So I think that in my excitement in having this conversation with you, it's definitely worth us at the Alliance and across our coalition to figure out, what does that look like? What does bringing religion into and using religion as a support space look like for survivors, and how can we take the best of that to be able to create community and create a healing space for folks? I don't believe that something like this has been done yet. So I think it's definitely an opportunity.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll connect with our group, and maybe we can talk, because that's really what we're struggling with right now. Is we want to bring in the spirituality of it. We want people to understand that they have that as a strength, but yet we don't want to be too specific or too triggering, to whatever. So we're really struggling with that right now. I think we're kind of getting there. We're having a lot of conversations, but definitely your input on all of that would I think be very enlightening. So I'll be in touch.
It's awesome. I think that's a really great idea. There's a couple of I try to follow a couple of like feminist and queer-centered religious spaces and temples and mosques. Even though I'm not particularly religious myself, but for me, it's nice to see spaces that are like at the core, like they're both religious and spiritual, but also very affirming of women and different gendered minorities. And that might be helpful to just know that there are other spaces like that exist.
Could you guys just pop your emails in there? I didn't.
Yes. I'm just reading Gina's comment. I do feel that the virtual aspect of the pandemic can help others come forward more because of the known discomfort that can come up with those walking into the offices. Fear of racism and discrimination, virtual options should still be an option moving forward to ease that tension. I strongly agree. I think the accessibility that has occurred because of the like virtual world we're living in has been really, really just like great to see.
Yeah, and I don't imagine that there's any reason for it to go away post-pandemic, right? The amount of individual counseling and support groups that have been facilitated over Zoom and other virtual spaces has been amazing, and a sentiment to all of the hard work that all of our advocates are doing. And I hope that it does continue. And I also want to recognize that, for those very reasons, it's very hard for people to come in person, whether that be because they're not comfortable being in person or because of their limited ability to travel too.
I'm going to pause our recording.